Before the flood, something entered humanity, and as it began to grow, the world was condemned. Violence spread across the earth, but something greater occurred. The boundary that separated heaven and man was crossed. They had a name, NEPHILIM, and when they began to appear, what drew attention went beyond their size. It was the sense that creation itself was being violated. Those creatures mingled with men, flesh with flesh, blood with blood. The earth began to bend beneath them. The environment shifted before a single word was spoken. Then the waters came, and when they receded, it seemed as though everything had been erased. But that was not what happened. When the waters finally receded, the land re-emerged in silence. Mountains rose again, valleys opened, and what had been submerged began to breathe once more beneath a clear sky. There were no cities, no crowds, no giants walking the ground, only a family, an ark resting on dry land, and the sense that the world had been reset. A covenant was established, a bow set in the clouds as a sign that this form of destruction would not be repeated. Everything pointed to a definitive ending. The corruption that had filled the earth with violence seemed to have been buried beneath the waters. This new beginning carried with it the promise of continuity. New generations would be born, new cities built, new nations would arise. Humanity would advance once more, this time bearing the memory of judgment. And for a while, nothing suggested that the past could return. The rupture that had led to the flood appeared to belong to a closed chapter of history. But the biblical narrative does not remain static. As the years pass and the descendants of Noah spread out, the world reorganizes itself into territories, peoples, and borders. And then, long after the waters have dried, reports emerge that sound disturbingly familiar. When Israel approaches the land promised to them, men return from Canaan describing fortified cities and figures whose stature inspires fear. These are not poetic descriptions. They are accounts from men who say they felt like grasshoppers before them. And among these reports, the name appears again, NEPHILIM. There is no detailed explanation. There is no reconstruction of what occurred between the flood and that moment. The text simply records that giants are once again present in the story. The land meant to be taken by the descendants of the promise is also the land where these men dwell. The sense of absolute closure begins to lose its certainty. If the judgment was total, the reappearance of these figures cannot be dismissed as a minor detail. The story moves forward, but the shadow remains. What seemed to have been eliminated resurfaces within the very narrative meant to represent the fulfillment of the promise. The flood ended an era, but it did not fully silence the conflict that came before it. And it is from this point that the story ceases to be merely the memory of a destroyed world and begins to carry the unease of something that insists on returning. The flood brought an era to an end, but it did not erase the memory of what had occurred. The land was renewed, peoples spread once more, and history moved forward as though everything had been restarted from a single family. For generations, nothing suggested that the world would face anything like what had preceded the waters. The promise of the bow in the clouds implied stability, continuity, a preserved future. But as nations take shape and territories are settled, the biblical narrative begins to reveal an unsettling detail. When Israel approaches the Promised Land, the very land destined for the descendants of Abraham, reports emerge that shatter any sense of closure. The spies sent to survey Canaan return, describing fortified cities, towering walls, and men whose stature inspires fear. They claim to have seen descendants of giants, men before whom they felt as small as grasshoppers. The text offers no detailed explanation of how this came to be. There is no historical reconstruction of what happened between the flood and that moment. There is only the record that figures resembling those from the earlier period reappear within the story. And not just anywhere, but precisely in the land where the promise was meant to be fulfilled. The tension shifts. Before the flood, corruption seemed diffuse, spread across all humanity. Now it appears concentrated, localized in strategic places. The people meant to inherit the land must confront men whose presence evokes memories of a past judged by water. The narrative moves on to specific confrontations. Kings of unusual stature are mentioned. Peoples described as giants inhabit defined regions. The conquest of the land is not merely a territorial struggle. It involves facing something that, in some way, echoes the earlier rupture. This is not a return to the global corruption of the antediluvian world, but the re-emergence of focal points within the flow of history. This reshapes the understanding of the flood. The judgment was real, comprehensive, decisive. Yet, the conflict that preceded it does not appear to have been brought to an absolute end. The presence of giants in the Promised Land suggests that the rupture was not completely silenced. Its form changed, its scale changed, its setting changed, but the confrontation remained. It is here that the narrative gains a new dimension. What once seemed an isolated episode of the past becomes linked to the advance of the promise. The land where the descendants were meant to settle is the very land where these men dwell. The path of the promise runs directly through territory marked by echoes of the ancient rupture. The story, therefore, is not merely about ancient creatures or exaggerated accounts of war. It is about the continuity of tension. The flood ended a generation, but it did not end the conflict. And as the promise advances, resistance becomes more visible, more localized, more direct. From this point on, what is at stake is no longer just the memory of a destroyed world, but the future of a promise that must pass through a land marked by the lingering echoes of an ancient breach. The presence of giants in the Promised Land is not presented as an isolated curiosity. They appear directly along the path of the promise. The descendants of Abraham, called to occupy that land, must pass through regions dominated by men whose strength and stature inspire fear. The confrontation ceases to be merely historical. It becomes symbolic. The people who carry the promise are required to face what echoes the earlier rupture. As the biblical narrative progresses, a pattern begins to emerge. No longer is there a corruption spread across all humanity as before the flood. Now the tension appears concentrated at decisive moments in history. Whenever the promise advances, opposition arises. Whenever the lineage is threatened, there is an attempt at interruption. Egypt stands as a striking example. When the descendants of Abraham grow and multiply, Pharaoh orders that Hebrew male infants be killed at birth. The decree is not aimed at a single individual. It is directed at an entire generation. The threat is not merely political. It is structural. The continuity of the promise is under attack. Later, within the history of Israel as a nation, similar attempts surface. The royal line is threatened. Heirs are pursued. The survival of the lineage that bears the promise becomes fragile at multiple points. The war does not always take the form of giants of unusual stature. It takes the form of decrees, persecutions, and silent massacres. The perception shifts. The conflict that began as forbidden mixing and global violence appears to have transformed into something more strategic. The goal is no longer to corrupt all humanity, but to prevent something specific from advancing. The promise made to Abraham that through his offspring all nations would be blessed moves through generations under constant pressure. This does not mean that every historical opposition is necessarily linked to the NEPHILIM. The biblical text does not make that connection explicitly, yet the repetition of the pattern is undeniable. Whenever the promise draws near to fulfillment, resistance emerges. The flood was a response to a corruption that threatened humanity as a whole. After it, the narrative presents conflicts concentrated on the lineage that carries the promise. The war does not disappear. It changes form. It is no longer the physical dominance of giants spread across the earth. It becomes the ongoing attempt to interrupt the continuity of the promise. The conflict moves beyond brute strength and comes to involve strategy, influence, and power. This shift prepares the ground for the most decisive moment in the story. For as the promise narrows across generations, it ultimately converges on a single person. And when that happens, opposition ceases to be diffuse and becomes direct. As the generations pass, the promise made to Abraham crosses deserts, empires, and wars. It survives famine, slavery, and the instability of a people still learning to trust. Kings rise and fall, nations emerge and disappear. Yet the lineage continues forward. When it finally seems stabilized, something occurs that echoes an ancient tension. A queen decides to eliminate all heirs to the throne. Children are killed so that no descendant may remain alive. The future of an entire dynasty depends on a single survivor hidden within stone walls. The promise nearly vanishes in silence. It endures. Years later, another decree resounds in a distant land. A ruler fears the report of a boy's birth, announced as king. Soldiers are sent. Homes are invaded. Children are killed before they can grow. Blood flows once more where continuity should have prevailed. History appears to move constantly along the edge of interruption. Whenever the promise draws near to fulfillment, violence returns. Not in the form of giants who once dominated the earth before the flood, but through human decisions driven by fear, power, and control. The birth of that child in Bethlehem does not occur in calm surroundings. He is born under threat. His family flees by night. The danger is not imagined. It is real. The lineage that crossed centuries is now concentrated in a single, vulnerable life. And yet, it remains. If corruption once spread across all humanity, the confrontation now revolves around a specific point. There is no longer a global dominion of giants. There is targeted persecution. The war has not disappeared. It has become more precise. As the child grows, the conflict takes on another form. It is no longer merely physical. It is spiritual, unseen, contested in deserts and indecisions. Opposition is not always army against army. At times it is temptation, accusation, rejection. The story that began with forbidden mixing and violence before the flood now reaches a decisive moment. The promise that crossed waters, swords, and decrees finally stands before the world. And the war is not yet over. When that child grows and crosses the desert, opposition no longer presents itself in walls or disproportionate stature. It speaks in a low voice, offering shortcuts, power without the cross, dominion without suffering. The battle is not fought with swords. It is fought through choice. For a moment, the cross appears to be the definitive end of the promise. The body is buried. Silence takes hold. As before the flood, it seems that everything has ended. But the story does not follow the predictable path. Death does not end the conflict. It exposes it. If the earlier attempt was to deform all of humanity, the later attempt was to silence the descendant. And when that fails, the war does not disappear. It changes its form once again. There are no longer giants ruling cities. There are no longer decrees seeking to exterminate a specific lineage. The conflict shifts into another territory: influence, belief, loyalty. The violence that was once physical becomes spiritual. The battle moves away from bodies and turns toward convictions. The flood was water against visible corruption. The cross was confrontation against invisible corruption. Neither brought the tension to an end. The biblical narrative concludes with the promise of future judgment, not with a declaration that the war has ceased. What began as a rupture before the flood has crossed eras, changed in scale and form, yet has never ceased to exist. The water came. The promise was born. The cross prevailed. And still, the conflict continues to breathe within history.